Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second summer sheep webinar, sheep series webinar. Tonight's webinar is going to be on joining management, and my name's David Brown, and I'm working for Home Sacket as the and Home Sacket is the New South Wales state coordinators of the Making More from Sheep program. Now, just before we get started with tonight's webinar, I'd just like to take all our participants tonight through the webinar platform quickly. So we'll be able to hear you. You'll be able to hear us on your computer phone, but we can't hear you. So this control panel will be at the top of your top right-hand corner of your screen. If you want to see more of your screen, the red arrow at the top side of that control panel will collapse it, and then you can reinstate it again by pressing it. Now, there's a questions box there. Please type all your questions in the questions box. Now, if I might just ask everyone to shoot a few questions in, shoot a few comments in there. I've already got a comment there from John. Thank you, John. That lets us know that you know where the questions box is and that I'm coming through. So if there's any problems, let me know in that questions box if you can't hear me or you can't hear Bruce Allworth, our presenter. So, and a few people might be kind enough to give us an update on the cricket that's happening at the moment, and Bruce and I are dragging you away from. Okay, great. A few people coming through there. I might just move on there, and just briefly, this webinar has been presented on behalf of the Making More from Sheep program, which is an MLA-funded initiative. So tonight's webinar fits under the module 10 of the Making More from Sheep program, which is wean more lambs. And obviously, joining management is aimed at improved conception and leading through to more lambs on the ground come the winter and the springtime. Now that's a great resource, the Making More from Sheep program. If you type that into your Google search engine, that'll come straight up. Just put MMFS or Making More from Sheep. Now it's got a whole library of information there. And I recommend that if there's a burning issue that you want more information on, it is a really good starting point, and I'd be more than happy to help direct people to parts of information there that are interesting and useful in their business. You can contact us directly or just jump online and sort through it yourself. Now, before the end of tonight's webinar, there's going to be a survey pop up on your screen, and I encourage everyone to participate in the survey. We had some good feedback from the survey from Rob Woodgate last week, and we actually take that feedback on hand and put it to use to make sure that we're improving the programs and delivering relevant information. And it's the way we feed our information back up to MLA to let them know that your monies have been spent wisely. Now, from that feedback of the last webinar, we got some good ideas for future webinar topics, and we'll be sort of looking at those in closer detail at the start of the new year, so that we can, hopefully give them back to our audience. Now, tonight's webinar presenter is Associate Professor Bruce Allworth. Now, Bruce graduated from Vet Science at Sydney Uni in 1984. And he's worked at Massey University in New Zealand. Bruce has also worked in the McKinnon project and has owned his own sheep and cattle beef consultancy operated in southern New South Wales and Victoria for 25 years. Now, Bruce is passionate about, best practice around joining management and sheep production systems. And as an associate professor at the Charles Sturt University and current director of the Fred Morley Centre, he has a wealth of knowledge that he's going to be sharing with us tonight. And we can be certain that knowledge is underpinned with a commercial imperative, as Bruce also operates his own family farm down at Holbrook. Now, with that, I might welcome Bruce to the webinar. How are you going there, Bruce?
Thanks, David.
Yeah, good, Bruce. I can hear you loud and clear, and we're going to be participating in a few polls tonight, everyone, so keep your mouse handy and keep an eye on the screen for a few questions coming your way. And I'll pass it over to you, Bruce.
Alrighty, thanks, David. Good evening to everyone. I hope you're all well. on this first slide, I've just got an overview of what we're going to be covering tonight. I've listed the things that I think are important, but we've got a question session at the end, so please be noting down your questions or fire your questions into David as we go through. I'm going to look at the length that we should be joining for. I'm going to have a look at the effect of seasonality and where that fits in with your flock. I'll just discuss the ram effect just to make sure everyone understands how that works. Look at the influence of both body weight and flushing on ewe ovulation rate and joining rates. Just remind you about weight loss versus weight gain, and also look at ram management. So that's what I'm going to do. What I need you to do, apart from keeping an eye on the cricket score, is to make sure that you think about what I say, how it applies to your situation. I obviously don't know who's on the webinar and exactly what situation you're in, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you information, and you can check off and see how your management program aligns with what I'm saying. I'm not going to be presenting things that are right or wrong. What I'm going to do is just try and explain why we do various things and why we might recommend things, and see whether that fits in with your system. And as David mentioned, the Wean More Lambs module, and specifically the first part of the module, module 10.1, has almost all the information I've got in that I'll be talking about. So if you want to look things up at your leisure, by all means do. But hopefully what I can do over the next 20 minutes is just to focus on issues which hopefully you'll find relevant to your system. So if we can have the first, David would love to run a couple of polls here, so he's going to run 2 polls here on when you, how long you joined for, I think, David.
Yeah, okay, Bruce. How long do you join your merino rams for? That's on your screen now.
So I hope everyone's getting that on the screen. I can't actually see it on my screen, but I'm sure you've all got it on your screen.
Yeah.
So they all filling it in, David?
Yeah, they're filling it in now, Bruce, and we've got 70% voted, and I suspect the last few will probably put their votes in a minute.
So I can't actually see the results from that, so you'll have to tell me what that is.
Okay, no worries. I'll just close that poll now.
And so that was for merino rams,
yeah.
And I think you're going to do one for terminal rams as well, were you?
Yeah, so 50% of people joined for 6 weeks, 33% for 5 weeks, and 11% for 7 weeks.
Fantastic.
And the crossbred ram survey is just up on the screen now, and a few people are starting to vote already.
Okay, so.
Yep. So 50%, about 50% are joining their terminal rams for 6 weeks, and 30% for 5 weeks, and 15% for 7 weeks.
Very good.
There's a few for 8 weeks and longer, and there's actually there's 3% for only 4 weeks, so there's a few outliers there.
Yep. Alrighty.
Okay, thanks. I've shut that now, so we're back on track.
Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So why are we considering length of joining? It's probably the most important decision that you make as a sheep producer during the year, is not only when you join, but for how long you join for. And again, there isn't a right or wrong answer. I guess it depends what your aim is, whether you're trying to maximise the lambs born, or whether you're trying to maximise the lambs born within a certain number of weeks, and so on. I guess the things I just want to make sure we're all clear on is that the cycle length of the ewe is 17 days. So as with any biological information, it's not exactly 17, but varies between 16 and 18, but averages 17 days, not 21, as many people think. So if you're wanting to join for 2 cycles, that's about 35 days, 34, 35, 36 days at maximum. So a 5-week joining would be for 2 cycles for youths, which would result in about 90 to 95% of ewes being joined. We expect around 70% to become pregnant in each cycle, and so if they get 70% in the first cycle and there's 30% left over, 70% of that's another 21% that gets you to your 91%. In actual fact, if the rams are in good order and everything is working well, you can get up to 93, 94, possibly 95% over the 2 cycles, but you will not get more than that unless you've only got 2 or 3 sheep, in which case you could then get 100%. So I guess we generally, I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but we generally try and give ewes at least 2 cycles. And if we have a look at the ram effect in a minute, we'll see that in fact 6 weeks, if the ram effect is occurring, is probably logical. The important thing about the length of joining, the really important thing is that the longer you join, the more lambs you will get, which is actually why you've got to take the rams out, because if you leave the rams in, you will continue to get lambs, and that will have an effect on how you can manage the majority of sheep in the flock, which will be affected by a few late lambs. So that's why we specifically don't want to join for too long a period. The other issue we need to think about is seasonality. Sheep are short-term breeders, and that means that during, and if you have a look at these 2 graphs that I've got here down the bottom, they're essentially with the same information generated by 2 different groups of people, but essentially you see that the major breeding season is March and April, going into May, and then starting to drop off in June, and certainly July, and over the winter drops off very rapidly. The issue with the joining period is that not only are all the ewes cycling at this stage, but the ovulation rate is increasing and reaches a maximum about March or April, and that will affect what lambing percentage you get. If you also look at the graph on the right, the colour one's probably easier to see, you can see the effect of mortal esters on seasonality. They certainly make the seasonality of the breeding more pronounced. Generally merinos, some merinos will be breeding throughout the year, but even with merinos they will fall down. Certainly in the October period and November period they can be quite low in terms of their cycling, but certainly where border esters are in, either crossbreds or purebreds, you do get a much more pronounced effect of seasonality. If we just have a look at the ram effect, which occurs when sheep are aren't cycling or are on the edge of cycling, the effect of introducing either rams or teasers is to get what we call the ram effect. Now what happens is that ewes that respond to this, i.e. they're not currently cycling, you put the ram in and it starts them cycling. What happens is the ewes that respond will have a silent heat 2 to 3 days after introduction. So that means that they ovulate, but they don't show any signs of estrus, and the ram isn't aware that they're able to be mated, and so the ram won't mate them. That silent heat for about half of those ewes will be sufficient to start their cycle going properly, and 17 days later they will have a normal cycle and they will be able to be joined to the ram. So that is 19 days after the rams or teasers have been introduced. Around 50% of the ewes will come on heat. The other 50% of the ewes, the first short cycle at 2 days wasn't sufficient to get their system going, and they have a second silent heat 6 days after the first one, which is at day 8 after the rams or teasers have been introduced. Again, that's a silent heat, so they're not joined, and then they have their normal 17-day cycle, in which case they can then join to the rams, which is day 25. So what you get, and in the little graph up the top there, the type 2 one is the response that some of the ewes get, where they have a single silent heat, then go on, and at day 19 have a normal heat, and the type 1 at the top have the 2 silent heats and then go on to have a normal heat. So the net effect is that you have these 2 peaks 19 and 25 days after the ram has been introduced, when ewes that weren't cycling will all be cycling. Now it depends how far away you are from the normal breeding season as to how pronounced that will be, but there's a couple of things to note there. Is any ewes that don't get pregnant from joining the rams as they come on at day 19 or day 25 will then go on mostly and have another heat 17 days later, so that will be at day 36 and day 42. So, and 42 days, obviously 6 weeks. So you can see that to get 2 cycles when the ram effect is in play from introducing rams is 6 weeks is an appropriate time to make sure you get 2 cycles in. So that's just as correct as doing 35 days when everything's cycling properly. So 6 weeks is very logical under some conditions. I'll mention a bit later again, but you can see with all these ewes responding, you'll need extra ram power if the ram effect is occurring. So if you're joining in January or early February, or even earlier than that, then you will need to take that into account. In fact, David, it's probably a good idea. Do you want to have a look and just let me know when people are joining?
Yeah, for sure, Bruce. I'll run that now. So I'm just running a webinar, a quick poll here. I'm launching it now. Now, Bruce, just thinking, if you had your control panel there, you'd actually, you might see the poll.
I can see it up the very top, but I can't actually make it any larger or do anything with it.
Oh, okay. Okay, no worries. Well, I'll be able to let you know what the results are just verbally here. Sorry, I did expect that the results would come up on the screen, but I don't think they are. But anyway, so about 40% are joining their merino, the main month of joining for the merino users in March.
Yep.
20% in February.
Yep.
And we've got 20% in December as well.
Yep.
With only 10% and 10% in February and April. So there seems to be a peak in March, then the second 2 most popular months are February and December, and then January and April after that. Okay,
well that's great, and you're going to do the crossbred ewes as well.
Yeah. I'm just doing it now.
While you're doing the crossbred ewes, I'll just comment that so just in terms of what we've been talking about there, those that obviously are joining in March and April will be maximising the effect of the seasonality, and so that will be just the normal cycle, and you'd expect that those flocks would only need to be joining for 5 weeks. The 30% or so that are joining in January and February, a 6-week joining there should be fine, but they would need some extra rams. But the ones that are just joining in December, the 20% that are joining in December, will really be getting a marked ram effect, and what they might be considering doing then is using teasers just to tighten up slightly the joining. It just removes the few lambs that you get right at the beginning of joining, and then you get a big gap. You don't tend to see that as much with the late January, February joining, but you certainly do with the December joining. How did we go on the crossbred ewes?
Okay, Bruce, so about 30%, we've got a handful in November, 10% in November, 25% joining in December, or 25 to 30% joining in December, 10% in January, 20% in February, and 35% in March. Now, I apologise if that doesn't add up to 100, but it's just changing as I look at it. But that's the round.
It's no problems. I'm not worried about it. It's just a general picture. I mean, what we normally expect, just because of the production system, is generally the crossbred ewes are joined slightly earlier on average than merino ewes, and I guess we're seeing that slightly by about 10% there. And I guess the other thing to be mindful of is when you've got crossbred ewes, the seasonality effect will be even bigger. So you will need to be putting up those ram numbers and watching that effect as you come through there. Okay, I'll just move on there and see if you've still got control of the screen there, I think. No, I've got it there. And certainly I'll answer any questions on that have come up there. I'll just, in the interest of time, talk a bit about body weight and flushing. Now, most people would put these two things together. They're actually quite separate in that they have different mechanisms by which they operate. Body weight is the single most important parameter for determining how many lambs you get each year. And essentially with that schematic graph at the top of the page there, it shows that the response in lambing percentage to body weight is fairly straight line, and it's been determined that it's every 1 kilogram you can use heavier, you'll get on average around 2.5 to 3% of extra lambs born, and which, depending on shelter and all sorts of things, ends up with 1.5 to 2% of extra lambs weaned. For every kilogram the ewe is heavier at mating time. I should just note, and I put it right at the beginning of the webinar, wondering whether people would just like to produce all singles. I don't know of a biological method by which you can do that. As you increase body weight, it increases the number of ewes that get in lamb, and it increases the number of twins. So you can't just create another 10% of singles by body weight or any other effect. The only way I know of doing it is to scan ewes, sell your twins and buy singles, or vice versa, depending what you're after. But as far as the biology of the system goes, as you increase the body weight, it will have both the effect of increasing ovulation rate and increasing the number that get pregnant. The difficulty, of course, under our conditions for most producers is that body weight is declining from January through till March, while seasonality is increasing the ovulation rate. So there is always a little bit of a payoff there, but the seasonality actually overcomes the body weight loss, but that doesn't mean we necessarily want the ewes losing body weight. We will still get benefits by having the ewes in better body condition. I've just thrown in an extra slide here in case any of you are joining ewe lambs. Body weight is just so critical with the ewe lambs, and if you're going to the effort to join ewe lambs, I would certainly be scanning them because the results can be variable, but you've really got to concentrate on the body weight. The reason body weight is so important is that they need to reach puberty to get in lamb, and that will be determined both by the season but more importantly by body weight. So two animals, one animal that's 6 months of age and one animal that's 7.5 months of age, both of the same body weight, the older one will be slightly ahead. But a younger animal which has a higher body weight can catch up. So body weight is very, very important. And if they're well managed, most research suggests that there's no detriment to lambing ewe lambs in terms of their future performance. In fact, there's some work that shows that you'll actually get increased performance from the ewes if they lamb as a ewe lamb. Interestingly, where they've looked at the effect of body weight, I said with the ewes it was 1 kilogram gave a 2% increase in lambs marked. The work in the ewe lambs suggests that it's closer to a 5% increase with body weight. So you really are getting a good response to body weight. But the important thing is that you don't try and increase the lambing percentage with ewe lambs by having a prolonged lambing, because that will, through management effects on the body weight of the ewe while she's lactating, really play against you in the following year. So I guess there's some points there on ewe lambs. I said I'd also mention flushing. Flushing actually refers to a very short-term effect on sheep rather than just simply giving sheep a rising plane of nutrition. Everyone says you should join with a rising plane of nutrition. In actual fact, if a sheep is 60 kilograms when you join it, whether she started at 50 and ended up at 60 at joining time, or she started at 70 and fell to 60 at joining time, her reproductive performance will be similar. The difficulty on a flock basis is that if the body weight of ewes is falling, on average you'll end up with a lower body weight than if they're rising. But technically it is much more the actual body weight than the rising plane. However, there has been some work, and particularly here at CSU with the Evergraze work out near Tarcutta, showing that the effect of green feed, lucerne, or even just green pick in the paddock does give you a very marked effect, up to 10 to 15% of extra lambs marked by as little as 1 to 2 weeks of exposure to that green feed at the time of joining. And some work with lupins has also had a similar effect. Now, these effects are not due to body weight change. The body weight change over those periods is very small and wouldn't result in anywhere near the effect that we're getting. The difficulty with the flushing work is that there's some information that shows that sheep that are on too high a plane of nutrition at the time of joining can have increased embryo mortality. So Susan Robertson, who works here, is actually put in for some funding to try and further investigate that so we can better explain when you can get the maximum effect from flushing. But suffice it to say, sheep grazing out in paddock, even on lucerne, access to a green feed for 2 weeks before joining would seem, if available, a very useful strategy. And I think most listeners on this webinar would have had the experience of higher lambing percentages in years when there's green feed available during joining period. So it's something you're pretty familiar with. The final thing that I just wanted to touch on in terms of body weight and joining is the advantage of stopping losing weight rather than needing to gain weight on ewes. And that's simply that you get a 3-to-1 feed conversion efficiency if you stop sheep losing weight, where it costs around 6 to 7-to-1 to gain weight. So the challenge would be to assess sheep in January if you're joining in February or March, and thinking about feeding earlier and not letting them slip rather than waiting until joining time or just before and seeing the sheep have slipped a bit and thinking you need to put a bit of weight on for joining. Because you'll get the same response with the body weight, but you'll get about, the extra lambs will cost you about half as much if you do it through weight prevention, which is just feeding maintenance levels so that sheep don't lose weight. I've just done a little sum there. It's always interesting to see what lambs are worth, and this varies depending on what value in your system you put a lamb. But at $250 a tonne at a feed conversion ratio of 6 to 7 and getting 2 extra lambs per 100 fed, it would cost you about $75 per extra lamb. And that's lamb probably up till marking time, so you haven't got the costs of marking and those sort of costs involved. If you do it through preventing sheep weight loss, it's down to about $35 an extra lamb, which is probably going to be well worth it at these sort of prices. So that's just a bit of food for thought there. So I guess the summary of this section in terms of efficient ewe production is we generally try to restrict the joining of the ewes to 2 cycles, remembering that the longer you join them, the more lambs you will get. And that's 35 days if you're joining in the main part of the season, and 42 days if you're getting a ram effect. The critical thing is actually to wean lambs from the ewes in the previous year at an appropriate time so that the ewes are able to maintain their condition or put back on condition prior to joining. And that is the cost of having a prolonged lambing, is delaying weaning and then the ewes being lighter the following year for getting back into lamb. Talked about feeding the ewes to maintain weight. We've got to balance the time of joining with the feed availability for our marketing. And the final thing is we need to think about the rams. And I'll just move on to that section now. So in terms of ram management, the number of rams that you need depends on when and what you're joining. So we've talked about the when you're joining and the effect of the ram effect. And just to put a number on that ram effect, when all the ewes in a mob are cycling, because the ewes cycle is 17 days, you expect about 6 ewes in every 100 to be cycling. So rams out at 1%, they're dealing with about 10 to 12 ewes being on heat at any one time, given that ewes will be on heat for up to 24, maybe even 30 hours, mature ewes. If you get the ram effect and 40% of the ewes in a mob are lambing with over a 24-hour or 48-hour period, cycling over a 24 to 48-hour period, then you're getting around 20, even 30% of ewes being on heat for those rams, and obviously that's about 5 times the pressure that you're putting on rams at a later time of year. So I hope that makes sense. Maiden ewes require more rams because they're on heat for much less time. They might be on heat for only a few hours, and not only are they on heat for less hours, but that heat is less intense. It's actually the ewe that seeks out the ram, and if that behaviour will be less likely to occur in maiden ewes. So you need more rams so that it's easier for them to join it, to find the ram, for the ewes to find the ram. And generally we would recommend that you join maiden ewes separately. Now I know there's plenty of, well not plenty, but there's some people who join their ewes all together and don't seem to have much trouble. I guess I'd be questioning year in and year out about running maiden ewes with mature ewes. The other thing to remember with rams is it's no good going out and looking at your rams the week before or the day before you're about to put them out. It takes about 7 weeks, 49, 50 days for the sperm production cycle in the testes to go right through the cycle. So if you want to improve sperm production, that needs to start 7 to 8 weeks before you're going to be joining, certainly at least 6 weeks before, and then the first few days you mightn't have quite as good a result. So if you're looking at the rams, go out and look at them 8 weeks before joining if you're thinking about they're needing to be fed up a little bit, or if you're worried about that there's been some sort of health issue. They really need to be sorted out 2 months before joining, and if you find problems the day before, you're not going to be able to use those rams. So just be aware of that. Lupins is certainly in our environment in southern Australia with the dry summers, low protein. Lupins specifically at 400 grams per head per day, or a kilogram per head 3 times a week. I've just put Monday, Wednesday, Friday there. For 6 to 8 weeks is probably, if you can get hold of them, reasonably cheap insurance for making sure that sperm production is at its best. The other thing I would strongly encourage is that you palpate the rams, that's actually their testicles, before joining, and certainly earlier if you're concerned, just so that you know exactly what's going on. Make sure the tone is correct. It'll just give you confidence that the joining is going to be okay, or warn you if there is a problem. And certainly if you detected any unusual lumps, you'd be concerned about it. And certainly if there's any blockages, that individual testy will be non-functional, and that will be dropping your ram power down, even if they're not infertile. And needless to say, the rams need to be in good order. They lose a fair bit of order, condition over joining over a 5-week period. You'll all know that and have seen that. If they don't go in good order, the second part of it, they're not going to be working very well. So now I'm just winding up here, but David's alerted me to the fact that Holmes and Sackett are running a cleverly named Ramping Up Repro, which is focusing on examination of rams at those locations. So I think at that point I'll hand over to David and let him talk to that slide and get the questions underway. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a great webinar and very concise, and lots of information that's, I think, very timely for a lot of people out there. And yeah, like Bruce said, these events that we're following on from this webinar with are going to be pretty relevant to everyone here tonight. We've got them starting hard in Yasp, Bombala, Cooma and Tumba, and they're starting on the 30th of January there. Now, they're a Sheep Connect event, and Holmes, Sackett and Zoetis are partnering with Sheep Connect to make sure that they're delivered and delivered well in those spots. So they'll be covering things like the importance of ram health, pre-joining management, all the factors affecting your ram performance, and there's going to be a very comprehensive hands-on practical session on how to do your own ram inspections, and that's going to be delivered by an independent certified vet, and everyone should be able to go away from those workshops confident to do their own ram inspections, and if there's any issues that arise in those ram inspections, then they'd be able to obviously chase up qualified veterinary advice from there. But anyway, thanks so much for that webinar, Bruce. That was excellent. Now, before we go, I will obviously Bruce is going to be online here in a second to answer all the questions that everyone has, so I encourage you to start banging them down in the questions box. There's already a few coming through there, Bruce, so stick around for us. Don't forget that webinar survey. A few people said it didn't pop up for them last week. Now, I apologise for that. It may have been because I quit the webinar too early, and if I quit the webinar too early, then attendees, then the actual survey won't pop up for the attendees. Now, I actually have a question, Bruce, if I may ask. We had one of the long-time webinar attendees couldn't make it tonight, and he asked me specifically to ask you a question. Now,
fire away.
This is from Richard, and Richard asked, he said, could you please ask Bruce a question on my behalf, how to improve lambing percentages from maiden merino ewes, assuming that they're already up to target weights for joining, i.e. What issues might contribute to poor lambing percentages for maiden merinos, and what can we do to address them?
Okay, and I guess there's two things here which is very important that we bring up. One is, I apologise that I've probably talked to people at the webinar and I've given a lot of information. What I've actually focused on is only the joining issue, and what this question really looks at is what issues end up with the lambing percentage, which is largely joining but can be things afterwards. So I guess in terms of the maidens, the critical things, when people say body weights are at target, there's no actual target. The heavier they are, the more you'll get. But within reason, assuming that body weight is under control, having experienced rams and having a sufficient ram percentage for maidens is very important because of what I've said. The other thing that I'd probably query, if people are having trouble in their maiden ewes, and we've done some trial work on this without really coming up with too much new information, but I'd be thinking about whether or not Campylobacter is a background issue in the maiden ewes. And I would be getting people to think about not following the full vaccination protocol, but just vaccinating maidens before and after joining if they're concerned about their maiden lambing and they think that everything else is under control. So if they've examined the rams before they've gone out with the maidens, the testicle tone is good, the rams are in good order, they've got at least 2%, they're joining in March and they've got reasonable body weights and they're still struggling, that would be something I'd be having a look at. And of course the other thing is having an understanding of what lamb mortality is happening. Maiden merinos are not good mothers. As a rule, some of them obviously are, but generally they're the poorest of all the sheep that we run in terms of mothering ability. A little bit of weather combined with the mothering ability, it doesn't take much to knock off a few extra lambs and suddenly your lambing percentage is down. So I guess they're the areas I'd look at, but we've probably strayed a bit off the main topic there.
Great, thanks Bruce. So Richard's requested a link to the webinar recording, as has a lot of people for tonight's webinar. I think Christmas is keeping them away, but he'll definitely get that answer, and I think that's relevant to everyone tonight. Another quick question here coming from James. Is paddock size critical for maidens? Rotate in small paddocks, question mark?
It's written in a lot of documents that paddock size is important. I haven't seen much evidence that paddock size is going to be much of an issue in the, I guess the only exception to that is extreme paddock size. So I think the difference between a 30 hectare paddock and a 15 hectare paddock, or a 15 hectare paddock and a 3 hectare paddock, is irrelevant. I think the difference between a 600 hectare paddock and a 20 hectare paddock is realistic. So in terms of paddock size, it is far less important. What tends to happen is that irrespective of paddock size, sheep tend to be in a relatively small area for quite a part of the day. So because they camp together, they're not spread right over it. But you would be concerned if you were seeing a large group of animals that didn't have a ram with them. But in my experience, that's reasonably uncommon, and deliberately forcing animals together doesn't improve lambing rates at all.
Great, thanks Bruce. Good information there. A quick question from Peter. He's out in the pastoral zone. Peter asked, when is ramping up repro coming to the pastoral producers? I'm first to admit that when you look at that list there, Peter, it is quite high rainfall centric, but when the idea was raised to run these events, we understood that we'd probably missed the boat for most of the pastoral producers with regards to their earlier joining dates. So let's get into Sheep Connect and say we want a few out in the pastoral zone, and we'll try and get them on the table in late spring and early summer next year to make sure everyone's on top of it. Quick question here from Philip, a good one, Bruce. Where does condition score differ from body weight for increased conception?
So condition score is just an easier thing to measure than body weight, but in fact condition score and body weight for an individual animal are identical. It's just we don't always know what that is, and essentially one condition score equals 9 kilograms. So if you can increase the condition score of your ewes by 1 condition score, that will increase the lambing percentage by about 18 or 20%. So it is a direct relationship. Most of the targets relate to condition score because it's something producers can do quickly and easily, provided the sheep don't have too much wool on them. But as I say, for an individual sheep, once you understand the relationship for that sheep between condition score and body weight, they are identical, and in terms of the effect on ovulation rate, they are identical.
Great, thanks Bruce. Bruce, we've got a quick cricket score coming in here from James. Thunder 6 for 102. And
ooh.
Yeah, and 13, it looks as though it's 13 and over, so it's definitely not what I used to bat at, Bruce, but sounds pretty good for the Thunder. Quick question here from Jan. I seem to have high percentage of ewes that get into lamb, but at lambing I lose a lot of lambs at birth. The lambs are all good size that are born dead, and I'm at a loss as to why they are born dead. Could weight have anything to do with this?
I guess I'm probably at a loss from this point of view as well, but just to say, are they singles or twins? If they're predominantly singles and they're a good weight, then the thing you'd be concerned about is that they're just on the cusp of dystocia, and you can get a prolonged birth, they still deliver them, and those lambs would be being born dead. The other thing that can happen in that same sort of scenario is if the animals are slightly low in something like calcium, then they will have an inertia or not push out the lambs as well. So they'll be normal sized lambs, but they'll just be taking a long delivery time. Normally, apart from lambs getting stuck, the thing we worry about most at lambing time is lighter weight lambs, which are usually twins, simply because of their exposure to the elements. So I don't know whether those comments specifically address. By all means, ask another question if I haven't got right onto that question.
Thanks, Bruce. Bruce, yep, Jan is welcome to qualify that question if he wants to there. A question from Philip. This is bound to come up. Is there an ideal ram joining percentage?
Well, if you join in March, April, when the rams are also actually seasonal breeders. It's just they're not quite as much seasonal breeders as ewes, so they have a wider seasonality. But if you're joining in March, the sheep are in, or April, and the sheep are in good condition, then everything is in line. People have repeatedly found that joining at about 1% of rams to mature sheep is quite all right. people say 1% plus 1. That came about with low numbers of sheep. So if you're joining 100 sheep, putting out one ram to 100 ewes is risky, because if anything goes wrong with that ram, you've got nothing. But if you're joining a mob of 600 or 700, then 6 or 7 rams is fine. The 1% plus 1, you probably don't even need the plus 1. So that's just within reason. In case one ram drops down, you don't want to drop below about 0.8% at any time. We did do a little bit of work looking around properties in the Riverina in 2012 and 2014, and did find a slightly higher 20% in crossbred ewes that had a slightly higher ram percentage. Now that was probably because they were earlier lambing mobs, and they were having the ram effect. So I would be encouraging people that are joining in January and possibly even into the middle of February to be thinking much more about 1.5% or even 2% of rams even to adult ewes. For maidens, I wouldn't be going below 2%. We can talk about that. I won't say any more on that at the moment, but the difficulty with maidens is they are more inefficient. And if you're buying high-priced rams, you need to be fairly careful about using them with maidens.
Great, thanks Bruce. Bruce, a question here from Austin. Is there any benefit from joining older rams with maidens compared with younger rams?
Well, it's what all the textbook says, and I don't have any experience with it. The only experience I have is actually from cattle, where we now routinely join younger bulls with heifers for various reasons, and seem to do it very well. So I suspect that it's come about through some problems at various times. There is a bit of a problem that young rams can take a little while to get sexually active, and you don't want anything when you're joining maidens not going right from the word go, or you certainly get a lag and then not as many maidens in lamb. So all the recommendations you'll find on the internet will all say use mature rams for maiden ewes. I can't tell you how important it is. It's certainly logical, but I'm sure there'll be people on this webinar that have put young rams in with young ewes and got away with it.
Great, thanks Bruce. Good question here from Angus. My father joins in December as he's worried about grass seeds for lambs in the following year. If joining in January, February, is that a valid concern?
Sounds like I'm getting into a family debate here. Very dangerous, David. Is it a concern for the grass seeds in terms of, I'm not quite sure, in terms of selling for meat, it would definitely be a concern, but there are management issues. I once had a client in central Victoria who said to me they couldn't do something because of grass seeds, and we looked at what it was costing them in their overall management of the farm, and he rang me 3 weeks later to say he'd bought a spray unit and sorted out the grass seeds. So I guess there's a whole lot of other issues that you'd need to look at to see how it fits in the whole farm. So I'm sorry I haven't answered that very well, but I'm not sure I can add anything more from my perspective from this point.
No, that's fine, Bruce. That's a pretty big, there's a lot of scope to that question if you want to go into it. Question here from James. Will lime supplementation, hang on James, I haven't quite got the context of your question there.
I suspect what he's asking is, I mentioned that on the point of lambing, that uterine inertia may be a problem.
Oh, Bruce,
I suspect yep.
He's actually going to qualify. Is there a rebound hypocalcemia when you supplement with lime, causing a lazy uterus dystocia?
No, but basically no. It's something that we definitely see in dairy cattle, but their calcium metabolism is so much more than generally we find in sheep because of their production potential, that we haven't really seen it. In fact, we've dosed ewes prior to lambing and not had any problems at all with any sort of rebound. It actually makes perfect sense that there could be rebound. But I suspect that most of the pastures that we're grazing on are fairly low, and it's only bringing it up to a normal level and not really getting it up too high.
Thanks, Bruce. And James, if we haven't, interpreted your question correctly there, just feel free to give it to us again and maybe a little bit more detail. A quick question here, more of a comment, maybe looking for a few comments from you, Bruce. The reasons for vaginal prolapse in ewes.
Can I get out of this by saying we're talking about joining here? You don't get vaginal prolapses at joining. We've got onto all the tricky questions. You're meant to weed these ones out, David. Vaginal prolapse, it's just a headache. The reasons, I can tell you all the obvious ones, but they won't necessarily relate to your farm. So overfat ewes on hilly country are a recipe for vaginal prolapse. Probably high clover may result in it as well, and actually coming on to James's question about the ewes being a bit lazy seems to be the way, but I've investigated at least 4 outbreaks of vaginal prolapse where I couldn't identify specifically what the cause was, which meant that we couldn't take any specific action, but the next year they weren't there, so that was, I should have given some advice and pretended it was my advice that had worked, shouldn't I? It really is a difficult one, but it is certainly nutritionally based. It's to do with better feed, it's to do with hilly country, and if you're on flat country and getting them, that occurs as well.
Okay.
I don't think I answered that one very well, I'm sorry.
You had a crack though, Bruce. It wasn't in the agreement for tonight, but there's always going to be a few like that.
I'm happy to answer any question.
Yeah. Jan's got back to us. He's very happy with your information. He was the chap who asked about the lots of good conception, but lots of lamb losses. And Jan, you're welcome to be in touch with us if you want to get more information on dystocia, and we'll be able to either help you out or get you in touch with the people who know all about that. Question here from, it's from Ralph, but I think Nerily has written it in here. They preg-test ewes and they keep only twinners, but their lambing percentages never get higher than 175%, and very few dead lambs seen around the paddock. And the question is, what do you think's happening?
Well, on all the statistics, 175% from twins is a average to above average result. Almost all the surveys that we've conducted, we lose around 25 to 30% of twin lambs. So if you've got, for every 100, if you've got 200 lambs and you're losing 30% of them, that's 60 lambs, so you're already down to 140. So 175 is going pretty well. The fact that you're not seeing dead lambs is surprising. I guess there's, I'd challenge you as to whether they are dead lambs and you're missing them, but given that I now believe that I've only just said that to make sure you're confident about that. If you are confident that you're not getting the dead lambs and you're getting twins, there's only 2 explanations. One is that there has been an error in the scanning, and the other is that there is some sort of low-grade abortion going on. But at 175% out of 200, it's not a particularly, it wouldn't be considered a major problem. And I guess the only one that we know about that we can prevent is Campylobacter with the vaccine. Would be a consideration. So I guess what I'd encourage you to do is this year, when they're lambing, to have a really good look and maybe weigh and get a couple of the fetuses and have them examined to see whether you can identify the cause.
Thanks, Bruce.
I guess that brings on, I thought of this, David, as we were preparing this, and I've deliberately only done 10.1 out of the Weenmore lamb modules. But once you're comfortable that you've got joining right, we're still going to worry about our reproduction. We're then moving on to the next issue, which is management of ewes over late pregnancy and minimising perinatal lamb mortality. And I guess that's probably something, if any of the people on the webinar are interested in, they might want to tick on your survey at the end that that's something they may be interested in, because I don't think you've done a webinar on that one yet, have you?
No, we haven't. We haven't.
Yeah.
Definitely on the cards. If people are interested in that, then let us know. Plenty of information out and about.
And maybe people could indicate whether they're interested, or equally if they're not interested, they might have been to there's a few courses that are on, they might have had enough of that. That would be useful feedback for you as well.
Yep, for sure. We ran a lamb survival workshop at Harden and Boree Creek a few years back, and they were well attended, but we haven't run one since. That could be timely.
We ran one at Holbrook too about 2 years ago. So yeah.
Yep. Okay. Now, Philip asked another question here. Philip's been a big contributor tonight. Thank you. Other than joining maidens, is there any evidence that joining in small mob sizes is beneficial?
No, there isn't. There's no information on joining mob size. It relates to the RAM percentage rather than the size of mobs. And in actual fact, if RAM percentage is limiting, it actually makes sense that larger mobs should be more efficient, because if one RAM breaks down, there's actually more capacity than to pick up. For example, if you've got a mob of 80 ewes and you've got 1 or 2 rams out and one drops down, well, obviously if you've got 80 ewes and you've only got them joined to one, then you're going to be in trouble if that one fails. But even if you've got 2 out there and one fails, you're in trouble. If you've got a mob of 800 ewes being joined to 8 or 9 or 10 rams and one breaks down, you're still well and truly at the right mark, if that makes sense.
Yep, for sure. Thanks, Bruce. That makes sense.
And it is the ewe that seeks the ram, and not the ram that seeks the ewe. Now that's hard for everyone to fathom, especially when we have the experience of putting rams out and the rams rush out and run around and look for the ewes. But in actual fact, once a ewe gets on, she starts looking for the ram, and then the ram gets interested in her. So it's her seeking behaviour that does it. Now, only a percentage of ewes will be coming on heat each day. So that's why the ram percentage is important. It's to do with the numbers of ewes versus the number of rams, not the total number of ewes in the mob, if that all makes sense.
Yep, for sure, Bruce. Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, Bruce, you're doing a really good job answering the question. So good, in fact, that we've got another, looks like there's another 6 online here, and they're still coming in, so we'll crack on with it. Chris asks, better to join last year's ewe lambs together with mature ewes or separately, i.e. will they have a normal heat?
Last year's ewe lambs are best joined separately, because they're still going to have a shorter heat because of their age, even though they've been pregnant. As ewes actually, surprisingly, and this bit really surprises me, ewes reach their maximum fertility at 5 to 6 years of age. It's only because of their body weight and wool production that we start culling them at 5 years. But I'm sure a few of your participants would know that if they keep older ewes, getting them in lamb is not the problem. It's looking after them becomes the problem. So the younger sheep, even lambs that have had lambs, still need to be treated as maidens in the 2nd year. The benefit of them having lambs is actually in their lactation. They will lactate better as a second mother rather than, in fact, their joining performance.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Now, someone asked, you must have mentioned a vaccine before, Bruce, and someone's asked that you, Sophia's asked that you repeat the name of that vaccine.
So I should have it in front of me. I'm not. It's changed a couple of names. I think it may be marketed as Ovilus or Ovilus C. It's a Campylobacter vaccine, and it's been variably marketed as Campylobacter and Ovilus, and I think it's currently as Ovilus, but I should actually know that, and I don't. My apologies. Somebody can be Googling it, maybe type it in for me as we go, because I've got too much happening here.
Yeah, that could be
that's what the students would do for me, David. When they'd caught me out, they'd look up the answer and tell me as though they'd just come up with it. Make me look really bad. So yes, so it's Campylobacter vaccine. The issue with Campylobacter is some work in New Zealand suggested that in flocks where they weren't aware the disease was present, use of the vaccine improved lambing percentages by 9 to 10%. We did a trial about 4 years ago. It was in a particularly good season on 6 properties that had no knowledge of Campylobacter, and we did it in the lambs or the maiden ewes, depending which they were joining, and most producers were actually joining lambs then. And we found no effect on 5 of the 6 properties, but on 1 of the 6 properties we did found quite an advantage of around 10 or 11% by using the vaccine. If you use the vaccine, it's recommended that you give 1 dose before joining and 1 dose after joining, or both before joining. Campylobacter generally doesn't affect embryo mortality. It's generally an abortion type thing in later pregnancy that you're trying to minimise, but it certainly will occur from any time from about 80 to 90 days of pregnancy onwards. So they need to be vaccinated with the second vaccine, which is the protective one, immediately after joining, because already some of those ewes, if you've joined for 6 weeks, will be 42 days pregnant.
Okay, thanks Bruce. So just to confirm, there is a vaccine on the market, a Villus Campivax. That may be the one that you're thinking of there.
That's exactly the one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So worthwhile researching whether or not it's relevant to this audience's particular situation. That's something for you to sort out with an expert. But there is a vaccine available. And another quick question here from Philip. Now, on top of culling for dries, we are now recording those that are failing to rear a lamb. Is this worthwhile?
Yeah. He's got to stop asking these trivial questions. But it's a very simple question with a very convoluted answer. The answer is, if you're in a ram breeding flock and producing rams, yes, it is absolutely worthwhile. Failure to rear and maternal and mothering ability have shown to be heritable, and if you select strongly, you will get a good response. However, if you're purchasing rams, it will depend what the ram buyer is doing and not what you're doing. In addition, as you cull animals that fail to rear lambs or that are dry, you need to replace them to maintain flock structure with other animals, and generally they're replaced with maidens, which aren't as efficient at reproduction. So your reproductive performance actually falls and your weaning weights actually fall as a result of it, because a higher percentage of the sheep are maidens. So I'd like to say that's great, but in some circumstances, and certainly in ram breeding flocks, it's a very sensible strategy. We should be selecting always under conditions that we're going to be running the sheep under, and that includes needing to be able to survive at lambing time. So that's a good strategy. Whether it works in flocks that are buying rams from other places depends a lot on what animals you keep and what the flock structure is.
Righto, Bruce. Thank you very much. Bruce, question here from Nick. Nick asks, he comments that you mentioned to feed rams 400 grams a day. An idea we came across was the focus feed idea, you may be aware of this, to use for say a week prior to the rams and continue for another week after the rams are in. Will this be beneficial?
So this is I mentioned lupins as a feed in flushing, and I also mentioned lupins for feeding the rams. Just to cover off on the rams, what I should have also said is, if you happen to be feeding the ewes, make sure that you've introduced the rams to the type of feed that the ewes are getting at least a fortnight before the rams go out. Because if you've been feeding the rams lupins, or they've been on a loosened paddock, or they've just been looked after by themselves, they're in good condition, and you're out there feeding the ewes and you put the rams out and you're feeding them wheat in particular, they'll go out and get a gut fill, and then there goes your ram power for that whole joining, because if they get any sort of acidosis in that first week, it'll take them 8 weeks to recover, or 7 weeks to recover in terms of their sperm from that sort of episode, and that'll take you out. In terms of the ewes, they've done a bit of work, and we actually did a trial again this year. I don't think that feeding the grain at a very high rate is a plausible thing to do because of the introduction of grain. Certainly anything that improves their nutrition over a short time would be effective, but the grain feed has been what has resulted in the work that Evergraze has done, and I'm pretty sure on one of those trials they did compare grain feeding. We tried silage versus green feed and didn't get the result that we thought we'd get with the green feed. So it wasn't just energy and protein per se.
Great, thanks Bruce.
You'll have to check that that's answered the question. I think I have.
Yeah, well, Nick, you're welcome to provide a bit more context around that question if you want, and Bruce will be able to answer it for you. We'll move on though quickly. Angus asked a question here. Is there any issues if your ram joining percentage is above the 1 to 2%?
A very good question. There are problems when the ram percentage gets up above 3% and certainly up in the 5% range. And that is that, as with all animals, there's a dominance effect, and you're not actually getting the ram power that you think you're getting, and the rams spend too much time sorting each other out and not enough time worrying about the ewes. So I would be very careful once you get certainly anything above 5%. I'd be very careful about the dynamics in that sort of paddock, and above 3% is starting to get a bit risky. Now, having said that, I actually join with young ram lambs that are 5 to 6 months of age in with ewe lambs, and I put them in at 8 to 10%, but those rams are only just starting to work, and I'm trying to make sure that there's enough that are actually working, and the dominance isn't the problem. The other thing you do have to watch with rams is mixing rams on the point of putting them out. So you think, oh, it's a good idea, I've got an age group, I've got an age range of rams here, I'm not sure what to put with what, I'll put a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old all together. If those rams haven't been running together for at least a month to 2 months before you join them, that will also decrease your ram percentage, because there'll be a dominance there, and the younger ram almost certainly will get kicked out in the corner, and the older ram will end up with double the number of ewes, and that'll drop your fertility.
Great, thanks Bruce. Bruce, there's a question here from Paul. Is there any fertility differences between plain body rams and wrinkly body rams?
That's a good question, and I actually have to say I can't give a comment on that. Other than, no, I can't. There was a lot of work done in the 50s and 60s on relative fertility of plain versus wrinkle. I'd be surprised if there is currently any difference with them, but there are a number of parameters that are associated with lower fertility, such as muffle-faced in ewes, and I just can't recall what the current status of wrinkle is, I'm sorry.
Okay, Bruce, thank you, that's all right. Bruce, I've got a question actually. There is an injection that you're able to provide ewes that you're trying to join out of season. I can't quite remember what the name of it was. It was a particular hormone, or...
It is indeed. It was marketed originally back in the early 80s as Fecundin, and is now marketed as Regulin, which is a melatonin one, and it works particularly well. I think ironically the difficulty why sales are so poor on this product primarily it was launched at a time when lambs weren't worth a lot of money, and so people couldn't see the investment, and I think it's something that somebody like Holmes Sackett ought to revisit the economics on it. My recollection from it was that it stood up reasonably well even with low sheep prices. So I would have thought at the moment for people joining out of season it would be a very good option. Of course, the difficulty with any of these products is they do increase not only the sheep that get in lamb but the number of twins, so you can get then more losses, and if you've paid to get the extra lambs then you start to get a bit worried about the losses. But it would definitely be worthwhile redoing the figures on them. I haven't done them recently, but I would suspect for most producers it would be a profitable investment.
Okay, right. Well, that's definitely worth considering.
Sorry, I should say for most producers joining outside the normal breeding season, you'll get the best effect.
Yep.
You still get a small effect in the breeding season, but it is very small and not worthwhile. But if you're breeding in December, January, you're likely to get a substantial effect. I have in the mind 10 to 12%, but I shouldn't say a figure because I can't remember.
Right, no worries. Okay. Question here from Chris again. Is it reasonable to use new 2016 rams over ewe lambs in mid-March if they have just had their initial joining with some mature ewes in February?
Logically it is. Most people would say be very careful about rejoining sheep, and my experience has been with a couple of properties where they've had this as a normal practice, that they drop their fertility just when we think it should be reaching its peak. It is surprising, unless you're joining at reasonably high percentages, the toll that the 5 to 6 week joining takes on the rams initially to then have to back up again. Remembering if you leave rams out for 3 or 4 cycles, the last 2 or 3 cycles those rams aren't under much pressure. If however you give the ram 1 to 2 cycles and then put it in with a new group of sheep, it's again under enormous pressure. So I would be trying to avoid that situation if I could, and being aware and monitoring pretty carefully, perhaps with harnesses on, to make sure that he is getting the number of sheep marked that should be marked, because it really will be stretching the relationship.
Yeah, rightio. Thank you, Bruce. Good answer there. Now, Bruce, I'm not sure whether we covered this in particular, but Nerily asks here, is using teasers worthwhile? I know we discussed this, and do you flush teasers as well as rams?
Yeah, no, so I didn't really discuss teasers, mainly because I'm not, I don't have a lot to do with teasers, or I haven't with the client base I've had. Teasers are a management tool. They don't change your fertility one little bit. A ram and a teaser have identical effects. The value of using a teaser is that if you put teasers out for 14 days prior to the ram being introduced, you don't get the dribble of lambs, which invariably happens when you're joining out of season, but waiting for those ewes to come into their ram effect seasons that happen at day 19 and day 26. So it makes the lambing date, everyone takes the lambing date from the date the rams put them out. Your alternative is to say, well, that they're really not going to start lambing for 19 days after I put the rams out, but we all know the odd lamb will come along, and so you get caught if you try to pre-lamb drench or vaccinate or do something with them. So that's the advantage of teasers. It will not alter your fertility. The only time teasers ever alter your fertility is if you leave them in for longer than 19 days before you put the rams in. Then you've already missed some of your advantage of having them in. So the rams have got to come in at least by day 16 after the teasers to get their full effect. Most people would say you don't even need to take the teasers out. The rams go in and bully them out of the road. I generally take them out, but that's not important. The condition of the teasers is not particularly important. It is all a pheromone effect, and so long as they're present with the ewes, they will have an effect. You do have to actually watch. One of the problems with, I didn't go into the ram effect in too much detail for out of season breeding such as in December and January, but one of the effects is if you induce cycling, you can actually get them, they then go back off after 1 or 2 cycles, and they actually don't come back in then till March. it doesn't always get them going, and they maintain themselves going. The risk is that you're bringing sheep up for shearing, you're walking them past the ram paddock. You're holding them overnight in the yards near the shed, and the rams happen to be the next door paddock. The ram effect will be happening, and then you go to join them 3 or 4 weeks later and they're resilient to the ram effect. So you do need to be mindful of the ram effect. The next smart person on the webinar will ask, well, how many metres do I have to keep them apart? And no one knows the right answer. It all depends on the prevailing wind and everything else. But suffice it to say, if they're next door to each other or in with each other, they will be exerting that pheromonal effect.
Great, thanks Bruce. And if I could just qualify there, Bruce, so do you need to give teaser wethers a hit of that injection, the testosterone?
Yes, you need to give them testosterone. It's usually 3 doses a week apart prior to them going out. Wethers on their own won't act as teasers. They need to be hyped up with testosterone to have that ram effect.
Yeah, and also just to qualify, and so the teasers you'll still get in an out of season context, you'll still get that big heap of ewes coming into standing heat at once, but you'll be able to put your rams in just a couple of days before that time to circumvent.
That's correct. That's correct. It's not the teasers who cause people talk about the lamb storm and worry if the weather all comes on that, which corresponds to the joining them. That would have happened whether you'd used rams or teasers. The day it happens relative to joining isn't changed either, because you've done it all relative to when you put the teasers out is to when you put the rams in and got that effect. So you don't change the fertility or the joining, you just prevent 2 weeks of lambs, of a dribble of lambs coming before you get the main group of lambs occurring on the ground.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bruce. Now, Paul has asked a question here. Might it be in the same vein as what we've been talking about? Is there any management options to bring Suffolk ewes into cycle earlier?
Only regular or the ram effect, and depending how early you're talking, but generally speaking, the Lincoln and the British breed and the Leicester influence, they're much more seasonal breeders, so it is harder. So anything that you do generally has less effect on them than on the merinos, albeit you get a higher ovulation rates, obviously, with those higher breeding ewes.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Now, Bruce, we're definitely getting our money's worth out of you. Thank you so much for sticking with the questions, and you'll be pleased to know they're still coming in, so I think it's testament to how they've been answered. But look, Sophia's got a quick one here. Now, their rams they've actually joined their rams for 6 weeks, and they came out last week. How long would they need to rest recover before joining with the second mob in January? We plan to give them 4 weeks break, but is this enough time?
So all I can say is, I mean, if they're on good nutrition, it takes 49 days for the semen production to occur, so that if they'll still be in reasonable condition, but in terms of their semen reserves and having high quality semen, they will be running down at the end of a joining period now. So putting them back in 4 weeks later will still be stretching those rams. And unfortunately, I wish I could, I can't change this 49 days of the semen production cycle. That's what's set. So anything under 8 or 9 weeks is a real stretch for repeat joining. I guess where I've seen it used most successfully is where only a small percentage of rams are used for the first cycle, then rested for 7 to 8 weeks and then put in again with another group, and some other rams sort of back up or pick up on these rams. But having the whole ram team out for 6 or 7 weeks, then giving them a 3 to 4 week spell and then putting them back in is asking those rams to be doing a fair bit. They will mostly do it adequately, but you're probably losing some lambs in doing it. You'd have to comment as to whether you're finding it satisfactory, but it won't be optimal.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. So, Sophia, your rams may have their hooves out for a pay raise if you go ahead and do that. But a quick question here from Paul. How do you increase the lambing percentage of the New England above 70%? So a bit of an open-ended one there, Bruce, but I'm sure you've got that covered.
Well, I don't have it covered, and I'm not au fait with the New England area. But the way you increase any group of ewes to over 70% is, I guess, it first of all starts with the genetics of the sheep. There are some breeds of merinos that will not be producing much above that, and I guess you're in a wool production system that has traditionally not needed to worry too much about number of lambs, and now with lamb prices being consistently good and sheep prices, it puts more pressure on it. So if the genetics of the sheep aren't going to allow it, then any management things aren't going to really make a big difference. The next thing is the body weight of the sheep, the things that we were talking about, and then the other side of body weight. I guess the two things that are critical at joining is body weight of sheep and that the rams are all in good condition. If the joining is happening, you scan your ewes, you can find out what your level of fertility is, and it's useful if you record for 2 or 3 years some scanning data. You'll really get a good feel for the inherent fertility of your sheep, and then it comes down to the survivability of the lambs. Now, the issue with the New England is they're better than most of us at joining at the right time in terms of the photo period, is my experience. So I'm guessing everything will be clicking in terms of it's probably a March, April, might even be an April, May joining up there. So that's all running well. It's still a matter of checking the rams, making the body weight short, and then seeing whether or not you're getting a lamb loss problem. But if you've got good lamb survival, then your problem is possibly with the genetics of the sheep. And whether we like it or not, the places that get really high survival rates are not where we run most of the sheep. So they're out in what we see as arid, dry areas where the temperature is very mild, and the survival of the sheep, of the lambs, is very good.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Bruce?
Did I just lose all the New England followers on the webinar? I hope I didn't say the wrong thing there.
No, there's no one seems to be leaving. No, well answered for a very open-ended question. Now, John asks about Dorpers. Now, Dorpers seasonal breeders, and is there a ram effect in this breed as well?
My apologies, I don't actually know anything about the reproduction of Dorpers, nor have I seen anything published on it. So you'd have to defer to information from people who have them. It would be extraordinary that any group of sheep aren't short-term breeders, so I'd expect that they still would be a short-term breeder and you still would get a ram effect. I mean, you consider a merino has little compared with British breed sheep, little effect of seasonality, and still one of those graphs I put up there showed that they can be quite seasonal. So I would be very confident that they are seasonal breeders, but I'm not aware of any reproductive performance parameters for Dorpers, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Bruce, Paul also asked about the New England, so he hasn't left yet. The New England question now, does sperm count drop during joining, giving poorer quality lambs at the end? So about sperm count dropping during joining, giving poorer quality lambs at the end.
So my understanding is, and we're really getting on to technical repro here, and I'm more involved in management than in artificial breeding, but my understanding is that sperm count is related to fertility and not to viability of lambs. So if the sperm count is dropping, which it certainly does during joining, and for all the reasons that we've talked about, and why I keep on saying that these rams that we're trying to back up and use again, we're really pushing the envelope. The issue with sperm count is that it doesn't result in poorer lambs, it results in less lambs being born. If a lamb is fertilised, then it's just pot luck as to which sperm has created that embryo, and there's no reason why that wouldn't be more viable than one created from one where there was a much higher sperm count at the time of fertilisation.
Great, thanks, Bruce. To give Bruce a rest, has anyone got an update on the cricket? They might be able to text it through to us and we'll have it there. Bruce, a question here, or actually a comment from James. Now, James said that feral goats will cause the ram effect as well for out-of-season breeding and can cause some problems. So thanks for that, James. Not something that I was aware of. Did you know of that, Bruce?
Yeah, good, very good comment, and certainly will, and will cause problems, but then there'll be other problems with feral goats as well, but we won't go into those.
Okay, now ABV, with ABV details, I think that maybe in ASBVs, do rams that are twins produce twins, or do both parents have to be a twin? Is there a higher twinning joining? Is there a higher twinning joining time for crossbreds? So sort of two questions there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look in, there's a terrific table in the Weanmore sheep chapter 10 of that David referred to, which actually gives the pregnancy rate and singles and twins. I probably should have included it on the webinar, but I thought because it was everyone would have access to, I didn't put it up. But it just highlights that the twinning rate will increase for all groups of sheep as you go into the breeding season up until about the 1st of May. So you get higher twinning rates, you get higher pregnancy rates, you get lower rates of singles relative to twins. In terms of the first part of the question, the ram does have influence over whether it's a single or a twin, and the ewe has an influence as well. So neither can be taken on their own. The other issue which is disappointing about reproduction is, of all the productive traits that we measure in sheep, reproduction traits have the lowest heritability. Now that doesn't mean you can't select for them, it just means that selection is slow and isn't going to change rapidly. We're talking about 15 to 20% heritability, while things like micron are 50% and body weight might be 35%. But 35% is considered moderate, 20% is of low heritability. So it does mean that there's, in terms of breeding twins from twins, it's much more likely to be influenced by nutrition and chance event than it is just strictly by genetics.
Great, thanks Bruce. And Bruce, we're getting towards the end of the questions here, and I'll just give you a quick break there. Now I welcome everyone to stick around for these last few questions if they wish, but if you are tending to head off to bed and it is getting late, then please take just a minute to complete that post-webinar survey. I value and MLA values the feedback, and so does Bruce. Bruce gets that feedback and helps him make a good webinar for us all next time. So another quick question here from Jono. When using ram lambs, is there a minimum weight for puberty, Jono?
Yes, there is, but the thing to do with ram lambs is there's a minimum testicle size, and they really should be at 26 to 28 centimetres, and ideally 30 centimetres, although ram lambs won't be quite as big as that depending on which breed you're on. But it's really a matter of palpating them is the best indicator of puberty. And it's usually pretty easy if you're dealing with, I guess the question was, there's a number of ram lambs there, you can soon palpate them and sort out which ones have developed and which ones haven't. It's actually the easiest time at which to palpate animals is just as they're going through puberty, and there's quite a change. And once they've gone through puberty, there's usually no troubles in terms of sperm production, but there can be a problem in terms of mating behaviour, and that's the other thing you've got to look at. So I guess if you're unsure about the ram lambs, I'd certainly be encouraging perhaps the use of harnesses. I guess in the last 30 years with all technology, something's fallen out of favour, but they can give you some very interesting information and give you some reassurance, although they are a bit of a fiddle, particularly on ram lambs, I must admit.
Thanks, Bruce. So I'll just encourage, or I'll take the opportunity to give the Ramping Up Repro another plug there. Don't forget we'll be doing a hands-on practical session at any one of those 5 workshops where as a participant, everyone will be able to get their hands on the testicles of some rams and feel for size, maturity, and some of the disease or some of the reproductive diseases that may be diagnosed through that manual palpitation. So keep an eye out for them. Regos are going to be opening soon, and if you want more information, don't hesitate to be in touch with us, and we will be able to look after you in that respect. Now, Angus asked a quick question for me, Bruce, about the feedback. So Angus, that feedback should come up immediately when you cancel the webinar, but don't cancel the actual web page, just cancel the webinar, and that feedback form should come up for you. Sophia asked about ramping up repro in the New England. Look, I'll put it to the Sheep Connect and see what they say, and there could be an opportunity to do that. We'll see what they say, and we'll be looking for hosts up there if we are going to run a ramping up repro event. So Sophia, if you want to host an event, then be in touch with us, and if anybody else here wants to host a ramping up repro event, be in touch and we might be able to sort something out. Narrowly asked, is there an ideal joining time for crossbreds to produce twins? Now, I think we may have already answered that, have we, Bruce?
Yeah, the later you join crossbreds up until the middle of April, you'll get increased twinning percentages for crossbreds. Yep,
perfect, thank you. So if there's any last minute questions there, fire them in. At the moment, Bruce, we're at the very end, so I think we've had a...
So I just point everyone out to that table that's in 10.1 in the Making More for Reno. It really is a good table on what ovulation rate you expect, what lambs you expect, even if the actual one of the headings is incorrect. We'll ignore that. The rest of it's very good information.
Rightio, no worries. Yeah, so jump on the net there one evening, if it's, or in the mid-afternoon, it's too hot to be outside doing anything with the animals. Have a look at the Making More from Sheep website. The module 10 and 10.1 in particular, it's got all that information there. But in general, that website is a wealth of information for sheep producers, merino and prime lamb producers alike. So one of the best resources you'll have available to you at the moment. So Bruce, we haven't got any other questions coming in. Our attendance is...
Well, I think that's probably a good time to end, David.
Yep, for sure. Our attendance has waned a little bit, but we've still got 30 out of the 50, so we've kept over half right up until 9:30, which has been a very good...
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so well, Bruce, thank you on behalf of Making More from Sheep and the audience. And we'll be running more of these webinars in the new year, so keep an eye out. We have some planned sort of for mid and late January and through February. Now those details will be coming out to you all in due course, and we'll be nailing down topics and presenters up to that point. So if you've got any burning questions or topics you think are relevant, send them through to us via the webinar feedback survey, and we'll take them on board. And if there's enough interest in a particular topic, we'll see what we can do to run it. So I think on that we'll call it a night. Thank you so much, Bruce, and thanks everyone for listening and supporting the webinars. A very concise and convenient way of getting information out. We want to continue these as much as we can. So don't forget that post-webinar survey, and on behalf of Bruce and Making More from Sheep, I wish you a very good evening.